Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Oris Stesiu, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you on behalf of the event organizer, the Ucrainica Research Institute. Thank you for attending today's lecture. We've lost the fight against disinformation. What do we do now? It's a perfect opportunity for us to learn something new, maybe even impress our friends and our colleagues with facts about Ukrainian history, its people, its culture, and Ukrainian politics. Today's lecture is made possible thanks to the support of the Ucrainica Research Institute, Delta Downsview Bingo and Gaming, and special thanks for the generous support of the BCU Foundation. Today's speaker, Justin Ling, is an award-winning Canadian investigative journalist whose work spans national security, politics, disinformation, foreign policy, and public safety. Based in Montreal, he's a staff columnist at the Toronto Star and a regular contributor to Foreign Policy, Wired, and other major publications. His journalism has been published internationally in outlets such as The Guardian, The Independent, Business Insider, BuzzFeed, The Globe and Mail, The Daily Beast, and many others. He has spent more than a decade reporting on the war in Ukraine and the threat posed by Russian disinformation and information warfare. Through his widely followed newsletter, Bug-Eyed and Shameless, he explores information operations, conspiracy narratives, and propaganda trends, and their impact on global politics. In addition to his writing, Justin Ling is the author of Missing from the Village, a critically acclaimed investigation into the serial homicides of 7 men in Toronto's gay village. The book won the 2021 Brass Knuckles Award for Best Crime Nonfiction from the Crime Writers of Canada and was shortlisted for the Toronto Book Awards. He has also produced and hosted multiple seasons of the CBC's Uncover podcast, delving into criminal justice and unsolved cases. Across his career, he has addressed issues from civil liberties and digital privacy to extremism, national security, and democratic resilience, shaping public discourse on topics at the intersection of media power and truth. And so without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Justin Ling.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. I know I certainly thought about just getting back into bed after watching that overtime goal and the gold medal match at the Olympics, but you know what? I saw the men's curling team win and I thought, I can do this. And drag myself out and I can give this lecture. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to delve into some of these issues. Talking about these things, as some of you can attest, is one of my favorite things to do. I hope even those of you who have heard me give a version of this talk before still find something new to take out of it. I'm talking to Alexandra, who has heard me give a version of this more than once. But listen, I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. You might be familiar with it, or at least parts of this story. It begins with a guy named Mark Blumenfeld. He's a pretty unassuming guy. He's really not exactly an important historical figure. He's actually the superintendent of an apartment building in Moscow. In the summer of 1999, Blumenthal received an inquiry by a local businessman. He wanted to rent some space in an apartment building that Blumenfeld was responsible for. The interested renter showed up. He flashed his passport. He says his name is Mukid Labanov. He's a local businessman. He pays for the rental. All is well. Nothing seems amiss. On September 9th, just a couple weeks later, an explosion rips through the building. This massive explosion levels the middle of the apartment block. It kills more than 100 people. Analysts say it may have taken 800 pounds of TNT to deliver this level of a blast. And it seems like the bomb was placed in the basement. So Blumenfeld thinks, my God, maybe this guy, maybe this Libanov, the one who rented the basement unit, he's the one responsible. So he goes to the police and he tells them everything. It turns out that there is a Mikhail Libanov, but he died in a car accident months earlier. The plot thickens, right? It kind of feels like it's a thriller novel. Blumenfeld provides a detailed description of this guy. And the sketch is pretty compelling. That's him there on your left. It's not too hard to recognize the guy. Thick glasses, white hair. It's an obsessively neat haircut. And Blumenfeld says, this is it. That's the guy. Someone would have to recognize this figure at some point. The next day, the sketch runs in the paper. Except it's not the sketch at all. Totally different person. This one has no likeness to the guy that Blumenfeld saw. This guy, darker features, no glasses, bushy eyebrows. It's actually not even a sketch at all. It's a passport photo. And the guy in the passport photo is Chechen. Police would later match this new unreal sketch photo to a real man. His name was Akhmez Gochayayev. And Moscow said he was a Chechen extremist, responsible for not just one bombing, but a series of bombings across Russia. In a matter of months, Russia would have a new president, Vladimir Putin. You may be familiar. And it would have a new war in Chechnya. Blumenfeld was always adamant. He had never seen this Chechen man in his life. He would tell journalists, researchers, and activists this over the years. And he would even show them that original sketch. One of the men he showed this sketch to was a former security official, and he even recognized the man as a low-level gangster with ties to the FSB. Of those who sought the truth, some of them disappeared. Others wound up in prison, like Blumenfeld himself. Others died suddenly and mysteriously, or not that mysteriously if you know much about Russia. One man, a former KGB officer named Alexander Litvinenko, wrote a whole book detailing his belief that the Russian government, not Chechen terrorists, were responsible for these bombings. And he held up this sketch as a core piece of evidence, and a core piece of evidence that the Russian government was capable of twisting reality to its will. For his trouble, Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210, and he died in agony. There are a lot of points in post-Soviet history, and I don't really need to lecture this crowd about post-Soviet history because many of you, if not all of you, know it even better than I. But there's many moments in this history that really paved the way for the moment we live in now. Not just for Vladimir Putin, not just for Donald Trump, but for the era of unreality and misinformation in which we currently live. But I would argue that of all of those moments, this sketch is a really useful one in understanding the reality of misinformation, the practices of state power in using it, and the ways in which we allow ourselves to be deluded. At this point in time, in 1999 and 2000, Russia was still nominally, at least according to the US and Canada, a democracy. Maybe it wasn't a liberal one, but it was a democracy nonetheless. It had more or less a free press, maybe sometimes less. It had institutions that were at least notionally independent. It had laws that were enforced, police that weren't required to follow the party line. But here, the state had taken an established truth, an actual fact. This man on the left had rented a basement unit that was used to kill 200 people, and it twisted it. It changed it in front of everyone's eyes. They altered reality to fit a narrative. And they used this altered narrative to launch a brutal, bloody war. And it wasn't just that the state had lied. It was that people chose to believe it. One might wonder if George W. Bush may have learned a few lessons from this trick just a few years later. But nevertheless, I think about this sketch a lot, because I think about misinformation a lot. And I think about the ways in which we lie to each other and we lie to ourselves. Over the last decade, we've obsessed about how we can stop lying in this way. We have identified it as a societal ill. We call it misinformation. We've talked about how we can fight back, what we as partisans of liberalism and the truth can do to win, how we can be first with the truth. It's a phrase that journalists like me really love. We've talked about how we can build up a system that prioritizes facts, and we developed countermeasures for this illness. We call them things like fact-checking and digital resiliency, pre-bunking, media literacy. There's a whole list of them. But I'm here to tell you that we lost this battle. These strategies don't work. Proponents of misinformation have won. We live in a reality now where it is possible to lie on an industrial scale. It is now possible to take this metaphorical police sketch, replace it with a picture of Akhmedaz Guchayev, and to do it on a massive national, even international scale. You can even do it now with artificial intelligence, with little work at all. We, partisans of the truth, no longer own the information ecosystem. They do. Nobody reads our fact checks. People don't care about our pre-bunks. Institutions and trusted interlocutors do not matter, at least not to those who actually want to believe in this misinformation. In our system of knowledge, truth is no longer a significant factor in the popularity of information. And we need to acknowledge that. Because once you accept this fact, it kind of frees you from the need to pursue a lot of things that simply don't work. It forces you to reckon with the madness-inducing strategies. It forces you to recognize the madness-inducing high-velocity rage machine we have built over the last 20 years, the keys to which we have handed over to autocrats, demagogues, and the men who want to profit from them. Misinformation may be winning right now, truth may be down, but it is not out. Now, I'm going to break down the rest of my talk. This was a little introduction. I want to break down the rest of my talk basically into 3 parts. 1, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we built this system and how we built a system that can encourage, allow, prioritize, make profit from misinformation on a grand scale. 2, I'm going to talk a bit about how bad actors exploited this fact to sell an incredibly marketable set of conspiracy theories. And 3, I'm going to talk a little bit about how exiting this system is actually easier than it sounds. And I'll talk a little bit as well about Ukraine. So, let's start a very fun idea of industrial lying. I'm going to pepper you with some data while I do this. Here's some numbers. And I'm going to work backwards a little bit. Because the simple fact is that people in North America believe a lot of misinformation. This is the results of a 2023 Leger poll, which found that nearly 80% of Canadians believe at least one conspiracy theory. This includes 5% of Canadians who told the pollster that the world is flat. Anyone here think that? Okay, we got 1. All right, well, that's like 5-ish%. 11% who believe the moon landing was faked. You don't have to raise your hand, I mean, if you want to. 32% who believe that COVID-19 was designed as a bioweapon in a lab. Even if you accept that some people just love lying to pollsters, which I actually recognize, it is inescapable that the popularity of nonsense has exploded. If you look to America, they have figured out how to do this on steroids. 32% of the country, based on several different polls, including 66% of Republicans, believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. In that 60%, of course, is Donald Trump himself. Nearly 30% of all Americans told pollsters they believe Democrats are involved in satanic sex trafficking. About the same number believe that Barack Obama was born in Kenya and that Ukraine is a bioweapons laboratory for the US. There is no great mystery to why this is. Human beings are prone to paranoia. The more complicated our lives become, the more complicated society becomes, the more we are exposed to chaos and misdeeds, the more we become anxious and prone to thinking that someone else behind the curtain is really pulling the strings. This paranoia has motivated everything from cults to witch doctory to pogroms throughout history. But it's also kind of funny, the degree to which we are prone to this kind of misinformation. And I'll give you a fun little example of exactly that. In 2004, a set of researchers designed an experiment. They recruited a cohort of participants, half of them younger and half of them older, and they presented them with a series of pretty arcane health statements. There were things like, aspirin destroys tooth enamel. Corn chips contain twice as much fat as potato chips. And shark fins can treat arthritis. Now, these participants were asked to encode each of these statements as true or false. And they did this a couple of times. They logged their answers each time. I'll explain this in a second. I know it means nothing. And mostly people got things more or less right. You can see in the top left there, that is the first round of this. They would say, yes, I think shark fins treat arthritis. No, I don't think corn chips are that bad. And then the researchers did something interesting. They gave them the right answers, and they asked again. They said, no, actually, shark fins do not treat arthritis. There's no evidence for this at all. And they ran the experiment again. And, no great surprise, by the third time around, after being given the right answers, people tended to get it right. But then what happened? They invited everyone back 3 days later, and they asked them the same questions. Participants started repeatedly, consistently misidentifying false statements as true. Some people went into the study believing that shark fins do not treat arthritis. They went in knowing that shark fins do not treat arthritis. They were told by researchers over the course of this study, no, shark fins do not treat arthritis. They walked out of the last day of that study believing that shark fins treat arthritis. Researchers found the more that they told people that something was false, the more likely they were to accept that it was true. That's infuriating. As somebody who works in a business that tries to get across the truth to people, that is infuriating. And you can see the actual difference there of people going from true to false over the course of this study. Suffice it to say, we have a weird relationship with reality. We have a weird relationship with being told what is true and what is false. The increasing complexity of modern life was always going to make this problem much, much bigger. And in 2006, the same year they ran the study actually, we did something incredibly stupid. A company called Facebook, again, you may have heard of them, they launched something called the news feed. This was the start of the social internet, one where you weren't just interacting with a group of friends or in a small network of like-minded people or internet denizens. You were thrust into the open internet. Your thoughts, photos, beliefs were suddenly accessible to all and vice versa. The audience of this digital version of yourself grew from a few dozen to hundreds to thousands to millions to billions, hypothetically the entire planet, over the course of just a few years. And in the years that followed that, Facebook would begin using algorithms to determine what you saw in your newsfeed. They would tinker with the variables which led to a piece of information getting recommended, all in service of keeping users on Facebook for as long as humanly possible. And they used increasingly sophisticated surveillance systems to make this even more effective. I know we all know this. This is a reality. We've dealt with this now for more than a decade. But I don't think the public fully knows yet, fully understands, and fully appreciates the degree to which Facebook's own engineers were bewildered and afraid by the thing they had just created. Facebook, for example, introduced the ability to react to a post. You could click a happy face emoji, a crying emoji, an angry emoji, and so on. You could vote with your emotions. While testing out this new voting system, Facebook discovered something terrifying. The content which elicited the red angry face emojis would do way better than anything else. In theory, this shouldn't happen. In theory, things that make you angry should make you more likely to stop doing the thing that makes you angry, right? Turns out, no, not on the internet. On the internet, in fact, things that make you angry make you more likely to share that anger-inducing content to make your friends and family angry too. Now, you would think that trying to encourage this would be a mistake. And in fact, several engineers told their bosses at Facebook it would be a mistake to build a platform around stuff that makes people angry. And they did it anyway. In fact, they actively encouraged this kind of content. This was the start of something incredibly dangerous. Facebook was not the only company doing this, but they had figured it out most acutely. They were stumbling upon a dangerous and powerful feedback loop enabled by this technology that we are still, even decades later, beginning to understand. The people who profited from this technology could not have been happier. Again, I don't need to tell you this, but I'm going to come back to this trend in a minute. For now, I'm just going to say that misinformation has become ubiquitous on the internet. Again, I think a thing we know. We initially called it fake news. We now call it misinformation. But it did not become truly impactful until we really figured out how to turn these emotions into real life. It was one thing to get angry at a thing on your screen. It's quite another to translate that into your day-to-day life, into your politics, into your community. Facebook didn't create this inclination in the human psyche. They stumbled upon it, they exploited it, they profited from it. But fundamentally, this is something that is true in the human brain. This strategy became a core driver in how we made the social internet addictive and therefore profitable. And I'm going to leave this here for a second. I'm going to go back in time again to Moscow in 1999 and even further back to the Soviet Union. Because one thing Moscow has always figured out very effectively is how to use information, how to connect it to emotions and anxiety. The Russian public did not magically agree to ignore Alexander Litvinenko's research. They did not agree to ignore his subsequent murder. They did not agree to do this because they were dumb or ignorant. They did it because they were motivated to do so. They were not just lied to, they agreed and acceded to it. They preferred a story of a noble Russia struggling against a radical breakaway region. They dreamt of a leader who would return the USSR's prestige and stability. And most importantly, after years of chaos and instability, they wanted normalcy. The best way to get there would be to accept the lie. Not just accept it, support it, to regurgitate it, to share it with your friends and family, to hit like. In the Soviet Union, we had two terms to explain these daily incoherencies, absurdities, and contradictions. It's what Mikhail Epstein calls hyperreality. It's what Alexei Yurchek calls hypernormalization. They're both different versions of more or less the same thing. The Soviet people had collectively decided that there was a truth beyond truth, a reality beyond reality. The Soviet Union was an anti-colonial empire. It was an international, cosmopolitan nation of nations, which its subjects were expressly forbidden from leaving. Its shopkeepers, and you may have heard this anecdote recently, its shopkeepers put workers of the world unite in their shop windows, despite knowing that the state would stamp out any effort for its workers to truly organize. Everybody agreed to lie every single day to keep the system alive. They did not do these things because they were stupid. They believed these things because they were motivated. They wanted stability, they wanted a strong motherland, they wanted to be protected from the instability of the world. This was a fundamentally emotional response to existential uncertainty. Okay, back to modern day. What motivates us today? I think this is a question we're still sort of figuring out. In 2024, a study published in Nature investigated the phenomenon of motivated reasoning. It proved that people trust, believe in, share, and reproduce misinformation not because they're gullible or tricked, not because someone paid to put it in front of them or told them to believe it, or at least not just because of those things. They often shared it and recommended it because they had an emotional investment in it. Think about this for a second. They wanted to believe this misinformation. They wanted it to be more true than the truth. This study found that people were actually incredibly good at separating truth from falsehoods. They actually found that they were relatively good at detecting misinformation from reality. But they found that if this misinformation provoked strong emotions, particularly if it was rage-inducing, people were measurably somewhere between 30 and 60% more likely to share it. It was factually false and emotionally true. And it was viral. But unlike the Soviet citizens who regurgitated slogans or put signs in their windows, this motivated reasoning was happening on a scale of both mass broadcast media and the World Wide Web. It was decentralized, and no one truly owned it. A 2018 study from the Massachusetts Institutes of Technology found that after crunching the numbers on more than 126,000 news articles, including some very garbage ones, they found that fake news was shared 70% more often and spread 6 times faster than verifiable news. For a time, major platforms promised to fight this. They promised to put boxes around this misinformation. They promised to discourage people from sharing this misinformation. They promised to turn down the rage dial and to get people talking to each other again. They tried for a little bit, then they gave up. Facebook has shut down its fact-checking team. Twitter has not just given up, it's actually turned itself into a misinformation network. Its owner now frequently changes the algorithm to encourage certain types of misinformation, usually ones, almost always ones, that comply with his own strange ideology. And that is just a small cross-section of our misinformation problem. If you were to design a map, a big neural network, let's say, of the world's major sources of misinformation, you would have to include the 2 largest social media platforms, okay, but also America's most watched TV network, a list of the highest circulation British tabloids, the state media apparatuses of Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, and a host of other countries. You would have to include a network of trolls for hire accounts across Europe and Asia, and, well, let's face it, a lot of other things. The scale of this misinformation problem is unbelievably massive. It is not just big, it is profitable. It is not just profitable, it is popular. People are opting, choosing, and volunteering to listen to these networks. People are falling from them in some cases, but also investing in them in many, many others. And that's just part 1. We know that people are inclined to believe in, share, identify with misinformation. That is, in and of itself is a problem, but it's probably a manageable one. Humankind has always been susceptible to panic and paranoia, like I said earlier, and while we may have built a new system which could create this misinformation and help people forge an emotional connection to it on a sometimes unfathomable scale, this might have been fine, so long as nobody weaponized it. So long as no one provided motivation for this kind of reasoning. But of course, someone did. I'm going to point you to this. I said I was going to come back to Facebook in a minute because, again, while Facebook is not the only problem here, they are perhaps the greatest illustration of it. In 2019, a Facebook employee got a call from a political apparatchik in Europe. Afterwards, they wrote an email to their fellow engineers. You can see some screenshots of it up there. I'm going to read a quote from it directly. They wrote, "Engagement on positive and policy posts has been severely reduced, leaving political parties increasingly reliant on inflammatory posts and direct attacks on their competitors. Many parties, including those that have shifted strongly to the negative, worry about the long-term effects on democracy." They were writing in this email about a set of very specific changes that had been made to the Facebook algorithm, including those that recommended low-quality news content and high rage-inducing material. They were warning their company that if they continued down this path, they had the potential to wreck democracy, not just in America, but all across Europe and elsewhere. And guess what? Facebook did it anyway. I think the sketch, I think about the sketch from that Moscow apartment bombing a lot. I think about this quote and this general email way, way more. It is the red flag that goes up and gets completely and totally ignored. And in the ensuing years, these politicians discover the same thing that Facebook had already learned. Whipping up rage works, and nothing gins up rage more than the feeling of being manipulated and taken advantage of, and nothing does that better than a good old conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are not new in politics, but they've always followed a pretty meticulous and careful path to power when they are successful, and usually they are not. For example, a few crackpots invented the idea that Hillary and Bill Clinton were responsible for a string of murders. They called it the Clinton body count. It was a very, very sexy conspiracy theory. Maybe some of you remember it. It percolated through word of mouth, through newsletters, through shortwave radio. It really took advantage of our inclination towards paranoia. It finally made its way onto a Wall Street gossip column, and then onto the airwaves of Rush Limbaugh, the biggest voice in radio at the time. Before long, it even had members of Congress fixated and obsessed about it. But this conspiracy theory, like all conspiracy theories, ran into the same problem. The media looked into it, and people at the time trusted the media. Pundits and certain papers may have entertained this nonsense, but ultimately, the source of factual knowledge in the world, from newspapers to the evening news, to history books, watchdog reports, and government leaflets, word of mouth, would come to the consensus on what reality actually is. And we abided by that. The Soviet Union certainly proved that if you control all of those channels, you can bend reality to your will. And Vladimir Putin would later show that you don't even have to own all of the channels in order to twist reality to your own benefit. But what we learned over the last number of years is that Facebook and the internet writ large and our system of mass information was not just good at spreading misinformation, it was even better at destroying trust in the institutions that helped us decide on what reality really is. At the same time as it was doing that, our politicians, our media, our civil society were uploading more and more and more of their own authority to the internet. They were signing over and surrendering their place in society to Facebook and Twitter and the internet writ large. Just as this was happening as well, a whole new network of social media, websites, platforms, streaming services, and others popped up to drag us even further into unreality. I hope you don't recognize any of these, but they have names like Gab and 4chan, 8chan, Parler, Getter, Rumble, BitChute, Locals, Telegram. Everyone I'm sure here knows what Telegram is, but nevertheless, there's a whole bunch more that I haven't even touched on. I'll give you a little anecdote here about how effective this new network really is. The official consensus about COVID-19, I'm sure you know, came from bats, moved to mammals, skipped over to humans. Whether or not you agree with that does not matter. I'm here to tell you that there is a whole bunch of people that do not believe in that. And not only that, they developed a really compelling story. And it was a really compelling story that ended up proving very popular on these platforms and then very useful for certain politicians. So useful that it helped justify a war and that it helped get a president elected. They developed a story about evil Europeans who were doing risky experiments in China. There was a villain with a British accent, which is very necessary when telling a broad conspiracy theory. You had an evil American evil scientist named Anthony Fauci. All of them were working together to develop bioweapons in China. We know how this story more or less goes. But then in 2022, as again, Russia invades Ukraine. You better believe they found a way to work their conspiracy theory into this as well. And it starts with a guy, of all people, a reservist and a manager of a wine bar in rural Virginia named Jacob Screech. He develops the idea, largely thanks to overlaying a map of airstrikes on Ukraine with locations of research facilities in Ukraine, which, surprise, they're in cities. He developed this idea that, in fact, Russia had invaded Ukraine to destroy these laboratories, and that in these laboratories was risky, dangerous research that may be creating the next coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, most people did not immediately believe this, because it's lunacy. What he was alleging was an international conspiracy involving no fewer than a dozen, maybe 24 US government offices, including foreign governments, including a lot of other people. But nevertheless, it started going viral on Twitter, and then TikTok, and then Facebook and elsewhere. Some places tried to fact check it, debunk it, deprioritize it in their news feeds. It didn't work. It went incredibly viral on 4chan and 8chan and Telegram and a whole bunch of other places. You started seeing influencers talking about it nonstop, asking why the media was not looking more into this question of biolabs. And then you see some pretty important people start to talk about it. Tucker Carlson, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now, of course, the head of Health and Human Services, Jane Bhattacharya, who's now the head of the National Institutes of Health, Tulsi Gabbard, now the director of National Intelligence. and, unfortunately, others. In a matter of time, the Trump family even endorses this biolabs conspiracy. I'm here to tell you that there was no fighting this. There was no beating this conspiracy theory when it first popped up. Believe me, I tried. I'm here to tell you that this is how things work now, especially in an era of Donald Trump, in an era where Fox News has infinite amounts of time for any conspiracy theory that helps the president achieve his ends and the party that is loyal to him. I'm here to tell you that Russia is more than happy to support conspiracy theories such as these because, spoiler alert, they developed this conspiracy theory. The Russian government, particularly a general named Igor Kirillov, developed this idea decades ago. It was just refashioned and repurposed for the era of the internet. Obviously, once this Jacob Creech fella decided to put it online, the Russian government was all too happy to continue encouraging it and participating in this massive, unbelievable lie. There is no obvious and easy way out of this. I'm here to tell you that this is going to continue happening. This is, at the end of the day, our fault. We did this. We spent a generation uploading our politics, media, and national discourse to the internet. Then we allowed a small cadre of incredibly powerful and morally empty corporations take control of it. We allowed a handful of morally bankrupt politicians to wallow in this system of impure information, to use it for their own ends, to weaponize it to get themselves elected, to use it to justify war. And we continue using the platforms that they use to do this. We continue watching the networks that they've leveraged to their own ends, and now we're stuck in a world that they're running. There is still, I'm here to tell you, a way to win this. And I'm going to keep the last part of my talk painfully brief. Whether we're talking about Haitians eating the cats and dogs in Springfield, or Ukraine is a Nazi state with a cache of bioweapons, or there's an international conspiracy of Jewish bankers, these conspiracy theories all serve to reinforce power. And the platforms that have become ubiquitous to our daily lives are force multipliers for their efficacy. But all I'm here to tell you is not entirely lost. There are so many experts out there who will tell you that if we just really commit to better moderation and fact-checking, to deplatforming and debunking, that maybe we can win the fight against misinformation. I'm a heretic in this regard because I think if there's ever utility in these strategies, and frankly the data suggests that there's not, then it is far too late to implement them anyway. There are some other soft interpersonal approaches that might actually be useful in encouraging people to not believe conspiracy theories and misinformation. There's an approach, for example, pioneered by some very smart academics from Australia. They call it the jiu-jitsu approach to persuasion. This might be familiar to some of you, maybe by a different name, but it basically argues that we can't browbeat people into the truth. It contends that no matter how many times we tell someone that shark fins don't cause arthritis, that Ukraine is not a bioweapons laboratory, people are going to continue winding up in the wrong spot because misinformation is sticky. It argues that maybe we're trying to solve for the wrong thing. The jiu-jitsu approach suggests that we need to use people's, and here's where the name comes from, we need to use people's own body weight against them. That means looking at what motivates people. So going back to that question of motivation, of emotion. And it suggests that if we actually understand why they want to believe the things they believe, we might do a better job of encouraging them and convincing them to believe the truth. That may be leaning into the fact that they're anxious about the future of their country. It may be leaning into the fact that they're anxious about their own health, or that they hate needles, or that they don't trust big pharma, or that they don't like war, for example. But it means leaning into that and finding a way to connect those values, those emotions, that motivation with the truth. You don't like big pharma. You know what big pharma wants you to do? Get sick. You know what stops you from getting sick? Vaccines. You don't like war. Well, you know who else hates war? The Ukrainians. It's somewhat compelling. And based on the research from these Australians, this is relatively effective. When they tried these tactics on hardcore anti-vaxxers, they actually started finding some progress, some openness, some willingness to engage with the truth. Now, the problem is, this is unbelievably hard to do at scale. The problem is, the platforms on which we would need to do this aren't very interested in this. And the problem is, it is always easier, more profitable, and more effective to lie. I would love the idea of the jiu-jitsu approach being, or any alternative to it, being the way in which we can convince people to believe in the truth. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. Because we built the internet to be prone to misinformation. Companies grew fat on lies and became addicted to anger. Politicians became addicts themselves, refashioning their politics into something darker, nastier, and more paranoid than ever before. We know this because they told us they were doing this. They told Facebook they were doing this. Facebook knew they were doing this, and everybody kept doing it anyway. From this have grown movements whose only identity, whose only feature is an unwavering absolute belief in misinformation. We used to laugh at movements like QAnon, which believed this whole satanic democratic sex trafficking nonsense. But movements like QAnon have basically grown into the president of the most powerful countries in the world and his own personal ideological army. That should make us incredibly nervous. We could do a lot of things that strike directly at the heart of this kind of misinformation. We could nuke all of the misinformation on the internet. We could blanket the earth in advertisements warning of misinformation's corrosive effects. We could criminalize it and mandate that social media companies take it offline. It wouldn't work. Bad actors, including those who are already motivated by this intense feeling of emotional investment in misinformation, would find new ways to create these misinformation networks. They would generate new lies and conspiracy theories, and their fellow travelers would repeat it. We would still have a system that encourages and rewards this kind of mass lying. In fact, all of this would become proof of the conspiracy. It would become further entrenchment in the idea that the state is trying to keep you from the truth. Even if we blew up Facebook tomorrow, the system on which our internet relies would mean that new social media networks would spring along and defy these orders tomorrow. And I'm going to keep saying it. We did this. This is our fault. We all participated in the creation of this system, and we all participated in it, at least I imagine most of us, every single day. Once you realize this, again, it's liberating. Because to my mind, it frees us from fighting these losing battles. Truth cannot win on Facebook, Twitter, or TikTok, any more than it can on Fox News or V Kontakte, because the game is rigged. But that does not mean we can't win the next battle, and ultimately, the war. Particularly in the English-speaking West, there needs to be a new priority on high-quality journalism and on institutions in which we can actually believe. And it needs to recognize that there is an online species now, that we are an online species now, and that we need new online systems that aren't controlled by oligarchs or those loyal to Tsar Trump. Decentralized user-controlled platforms, which have a community-driven interest in combating misinformation, is part of the solution here. This is wonky and it's technical, but it's also really important. This is not wacky either. Hugely popular social media networks like Reddit operate more or less on this basis. Others, like Blue Sky, are having some success with similar tactics. In fact, there's even a new one coming online very shortly that is Canadian-specific, called Gander, that it hopes to, and this is what's important about these platforms, that hopes to remove the profit incentive from sharing information and going viral. This will probably help. But fundamentally, we also need to realize that the internet makes us kind of crazy. We need to realize that so long as we upload conversations, democratic engagement, media, truth-telling onto the internet, it will always get distorted. I know I probably don't need to lecture this audience on the idea that there is a world outside of our phones and laptops, but the simple fact is that our politics are increasingly being shaped by people who interpret reality through the internet. We need to unplug from the system wherever and whenever we can, because it's making people angry and crazy. We need trust again. We need a shared sense of purpose and a self that extends beyond these madness-inducing platforms. And I'll tell you, there's a few places in the world that have figured this out. One of them, while not perfect, is Ukraine. Yes, Ukrainians still rely on some less than stellar TV stations and radio. Yes, I'm going to tell you, you rely way too much on Telegram. Yes, there is an innate paranoia that goes through the Ukrainian psyche, much as there is on every human being on the planet, perhaps more so the Americans these days. But I'm here to tell you that there has been an enormous amount of success in combating this sense of uber online, internet-fed paranoia in Ukraine. Crisis and chaos have a real ability to focus the mind. Solidarity can be a kryptonite for division, anxiety, and lies. I think to some degree, Canada writ large is learning this as well over the last year. We may have lost this fight against misinformation because we're still playing on enemy turf. If we hope to win the war, we're going to need to retreat back into reality, back into spaces where we actually talk to each other, once again, where we show up in rooms like this to have thoughtful conversations, and where we don't spend so much of our damn time on places that seem loyal to Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for a very valuable, very interesting lecture.
Some countries are tackling this by focusing on youth. So Australia has banned social media for those under 16. The Nordic countries have for a long time incorporated critical thinking and media literacy training in their school systems starting from kindergarten. Do those strategies offer us any hope?
This is the worst possible answer, but I don't know. But they're a good idea anyway, which is a very cop-out answer. I mean, listen, the reality is the things I'm describing here are one of the externalities of the internet. Guess what? There's more. We know that social media makes teens more anxious, more disconnected from each other. We know it is connected to certain bad mental health outcomes. We know that it is more likely to get them addicted to gambling, for example, which is the thing we haven't begun tackling or even properly understanding. So, banning social media for those under 16, it couldn't hurt. And frankly, there's an enormous number of social media companies who, in their own policies, say they do not allow anyone under the age of 13 on their platform for a variety of obviously very good reasons, and yet allow it anyway. I think starting to put some real obligations on those platforms is just an unqualifiedly good idea. Will it substantially decrease our penchant for misinformation? I hope so. I don't think. I'm not incredibly optimistic because, let's be real, it's not youth who are largely uploading a lot of our, let's say, democratic interactions to social media. I mean, kids still have to, and minus the pandemic, still have to go to a classroom every day and talk to each other and debate and argue and discuss. And if there's any teachers in the room, I know that it's gotten much worse over the last couple of years, but they still have to do it. It's not them that have uploaded all of these things to the internet. It's the adults who did. So, counter proposal, under 16s are allowed on social media and everyone older than 16 are banned. Just a thought. No, quite genuinely, it's a good idea, but I don't know that it's going to change the game all that much.
Just a quick question. How do you see ChatGPT adding into the soup?
Yeah, in case you didn't hear that, how do I see ChatGPT and AI and large language models interacting with this problem? Negatively, for one. I barely even touched on it in this speech because I don't think we know yet just how bad it's going to be, but we know it's going to be pretty bad. from the outset, including some of my colleagues, there was this optimism that ChatGPT, and I'll just say ChatGPT for simplicity's sake, would become a source of truth, right? Would be a way to fact check, to validate, to provide people this new ability to check reality, right? It would become what the newspaper used to be, or what the state media or the CBC or whatever used to be. And from the outset, that always struck me as an incredibly dangerous, stupid, and naive proposition. And I've told some colleagues this in as many terms. Because, for one, these platforms are incredibly prone to hallucination. We know this. The company owners keep saying they're getting better at it, but frankly, every new iteration of these systems, there is still an enormous amount of hallucination, of just made up nonsense. To this day, if you go into ChatGPT, depending on when you ask it, it'll tell you that Justin Trudeau is still the Prime Minister of Canada, that Mark Carney has never considered running, that Donald Trump is still in exile somewhere, and that the previous Pope is still alive, right? These systems are not always that good, and we frequently don't know how they're deriving the answers they provide us. So that's the baseline problem. On top of that, we also know it's unbelievably easy to what they call poison these models. Feeding in a single blog or a single news article can help convince, I'm talking about it in human terms, it's not, right? It's a system of guessing, but can convince the software that this is reality. So there was a really good example of this recently. Somebody basically wrote a blog on their website saying that they, I think, were the world poker champion or something, and then went and asked ChatGPT what this person's accomplishments were, and ChatGPT said, well, he's the world poker champion, of course. To do that from a more nefarious point of view, it would take almost nothing for Russia to pump out shoddy, troll-created blogs and fake news articles telling ChatGPT that, in fact, yes, Ukraine is full of Nazis, or what have you, or to seed and spread new forms of conspiracy theories. It would be unbelievably easy. But more than that, because it just keeps getting worse, more than that, it further entrenches the idea that we cannot be trusted to tell the truth to each other, that institutions we created can't be relied upon to delineate the truth, that only technology, this kind of shining city on a hill that we have not yet quite reached, can truly figure out what the truth is. If you listen to the conspiracy theorists and those who peddle misinformation, Joe Rogan is a prime example. If you listen to them, they're frequently hitting at this idea that all of our old institutions are broken, corrupted, and fundamentally nefarious, whether it's the media, whether it's government, whether it's public health, whether it's anything else. Flowing out of that is the idea that we need to build something that can finally correct all their misdeeds. And that, to them, is ChatGPT. I think if we go along with that, we are signing our own death warrant for the truth. And that sounds dramatic, but I don't think we could overstate just how dangerous of a path we're walking down. I should have included that in the talk. At a certain point, you get a little depressed, and you got to keep it a little light. I'll have it over here.
Large portion of your talk, you focused on the role of the internet, Facebook, social media, platforms for the change in the acceleration of misinformation and to learn. But to what extent also do you think the actual media outlets and in particular newspapers and the traditional ones are responsible in that they've changed at the same time in terms of there's a lot fewer journalists. There's a lot less reporting. It's mostly opinion pieces because that's easy, as opposed to having to investigate and spend a lot of time to report. It's a lot easier to write down just opinions.
As a columnist, I think I have to technically disagree with that, but okay.
Well, but no, you don't have to interview people. You don't have to put it all together, and and then also there's been go into one hands foreign ownership, and foreign owners also might influence the actual and, the opinions.
Yep.
And so to what extent, what extent do you think the actual owners of the media, as well as the journalists themselves, are responsible for this? And what can they do in order to improve the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, I mean, I could be defensive, but I won't be. I'll just tell you, we're absolutely to blame for a lot of this, right? And, I'm a columnist. I'm on the opinion side of the Toronto Star. Why do I have my job? Because to a large degree, opinion does better on social media and the internet than reporting does. That is a simple fact. I don't like it any more than you do. I do try and do interviews and research for my columns, but I can also tell you some of my colleagues don't. So it's a pretty fair criticism, and whatever. I don't think I see any of my colleagues in the room. Listen, you can't divorce the fact that the internet did that to the newspaper, right? Like the system of getting truth back in the day, and most of us in the room, not all of us, I see young faces in here as well. Most of us still remember getting dead paper, dead trees thrown at our doorstep every day. We spent an hour figuring out what was more or less true in the world. Did we believe every single word that was in the newspaper? No. We approached it with critical thinking, but we had a generally good relationship with the newspaper to which we subscribed. And if you didn't want the newspaper, you had the radio or you had TV, right? That worked pretty well. When we uploaded that system to the internet, when we started moving all of this online, we also surrendered our ability to make money to those companies. Facebook and Google now own roughly 70 to 80% of all online advertising revenue. That happened at a time when our advertising revenue, us being the newspapers, went off an absolute cliff. The actual graph looks basically like that. We surrendered these dollars and the ability to make them to these companies. In return, they gave us peanuts. In return, right now, Facebook is still banning news content in Canada and refusing to compensate the companies which it used to make money, which it used to get legitimacy, right? I mean, my paper, every paper in Canada, had partnerships with Facebook. They called Facebook a partner in news. And what did Facebook do in return? It actively undermined all their reporting, encouraged misinformation, stole their advertising dollars, and then kicked them off the platform, right? To underline just how nefarious these platforms are, I think we really do have to recognize that everything does flow back to this decision we made 2 decades ago. On top of that, we also have to reckon with the fact that newspapers and news media started playing in to the anger that became endemic on the internet. There's a graph I sometimes included, I didn't in this talk, but there's a graph that actually charts out the sentiment of newspaper headlines over time. You go back to the 90s and the early 2000s, and basically the vast majority of newspaper headlines were more or less neutral. Some would invoke sadness, there's a tragedy that happens in town. Some would invoke anger. You'll never guess what the government did recently. But generally speaking, newspapers had a pretty buttoned up approach to how they presented the news. 2006, 2007, 2008, when Facebook starts becoming more ubiquitous, and then later Twitter and elsewhere, you see all sentiments basically go down like this, and anger go up like that. We decided to participate in the game that Facebook was playing, and we have only ourselves to blame for it. When I kept saying in my talk, we did this to ourselves, I absolutely mean the news media as well. And we're now presenting an inferior product, because we have fewer journalists, less resources, less reach, to fewer and fewer people, and we are fundamentally incapable of competing with the new crazy-inducing information ecosystem that exists online. So, yeah, we bear blame too.
Can you comment on confirmation bias and the jeopardy of echo chambers?
I'm actually a skeptic on the idea that echo chambers are a significant problem online. There's some competing research on this. Most of the good research suggests that people who participate in ideologically closed spaces, right? People who, for example, hang out in pro-MAGA Facebook groups or Black Lives Matter Reddit subreddits or whatever, they actually tend to spend a lot of time discussing stuff in those communities, but they also spend a lot of time getting news and information elsewhere. In fact, there's a little bit of evidence that suggests that people who spend time in highly partisan spaces read more opposite news than everybody else. They're more likely to go out and find news content that speaks against what they believe, which is interesting. Now, there's a lot of kind of particulars of that. But nevertheless, I don't think echo chambers are necessarily a bad thing, right? There was a time in our society where we had liberal lefty papers, where we had conservative papers, right? There were times where we hung out in social groups and political parties. What are political parties if not echo chambers? The question becomes, is there a central point or central points where people can sort of show up and disintermediate, that's a really technical term, but basically try and disentangle those different beliefs that they picked up and developed in their echo chambers. And that's what we're lacking, right? That is fundamentally and seriously what we're lacking, and everything on the internet is a pale facsimile of what we want it to be, right? Twitter makes this claim that it's the digital town hall, which if it were true would be amazing. That's actually what we need. That's what we would hope the internet could be, a place where you could go into your little echo chambers and then come out and joust and fight in this big open square, and conservatives and liberals and socialists and fascists could all argue and the truth would sort of win out. Problem is, it doesn't seem to work that way. It seems like the echo chambers are working really well, but that central square is the part that's broken. So my feeling is that fighting against echo chambers is a bit of a misdirect, but if I'm being honest, everything about the internet is so broken that, it's part of the problem too, sure. There was a question over here, yeah.
So from a Ukrainian perspective, I think most of the people that are active online will probably agree with me to say that we're fighting a lot of these monoliths, these huge organizations that aren't typically sympathetic to our cause. We start with the UN. Now we've seen the Winter Olympic Games, but we're talking about Amnesty International. We're talking about FIFA. We're talking about all kinds of other organizations. And who's doing the ballot from the Ukrainian side? Is this ad hoc, or should there be committees either through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine doing battle? And meanwhile, under our noses, at TIFF, we had a problem that we couldn't deal with. We thought we had a friendly government here that ended up giving $340,000 via TV Ontario to Trofimova, who ended up filming this film in occupied Ukraine, and there was nothing that the community or the Ukrainian government could do about it. And if you want to talk about frustrating, you can't get more frustrating than that. So we've got these big organizations that won't apologize, even if they've misspoken or misquoted. Amnesty International really blasted us for some war crime violations, and in the end, that gets disseminated. And who in the Ukrainian community should be speaking to these issues, and if more effectively, I suppose.
Everything you just described to me, though, and this is going to be a frustrating answer, I accept that, feels like a victory. Because there is still a Ukrainian community that believes in organizing and public pressure and engaging with institutions. Did you win every one of those fights? No. But you started a conversation, and I know that sounds like a real platitude, but you started a conversation, you did, and people actually responded to it. And there is genuine, and maybe this is a little optimistic, but you have to find optimism where you can get it these days. There is a genuine kind of conversation and reaction that I think happened in the Canadian public when Ukraine and the Ukrainian community made those arguments, started those campaigns, started pushing those buttons in a way that I don't see in other spaces. And the fight around Russians at War, the TIFF movie, which I actually wrote about in the Star, and I interviewed the director, who is an interesting lady. The conversation that erupted around that, I actually think did do a lot of good in terms of actually getting people to go, for example, see 80 Days in Mariupol. I can't remember the exact title, that sounds right. Yeah. 20 days in Mariupol. I actually think that it did change minds, get people to start thinking about these issues. I think it actually helped people go see that movie if they went to see it with a level of skepticism they didn't have before. That, to me, fine, you didn't convince TIFF entirely to back down. I think you probably did convince, I think it was TFO, to think more seriously about how it funds movies in the future. I don't know. I think that is, to some degree, a victory. I think you can't understate, even when it's not successful, the impact of community organizing and how rare it's become these days. I think there are a ton of community organizations and nationalities in Canada that would kill for the level of community engagement, interest, and mobilization that the Ukrainian community can actually manage. And I'm not blowing smoke up your ass here. I'm genuinely telling you, I think there's actually a lot to learn from how the Ukrainian community in Canada and around the world responds to these things. You don't win every battle, but the fact that you can actually fight it effectively, I think is actually encouraging and makes me think that there is a life after the internet.
I want to compliment you on the article you wrote about the film that caused all the controversy about the pro-Russian film as we saw it. And I concur with you. I'm sure you know, and people here in this audience probably do also, that there are entire warehouses of people in Russia pumping out the propaganda, etc. That side, I think, is pretty clear to everybody. But a problem I'm having is normal people, the people I deal with day in, day out, to say to them, well, listen, it's all your fault, that the internet is not, properly behaving, that all these social media organizations have, arisen, etc. If we took a canvas of this audience here today, I doubt anybody would stand up and say, yes, I promote these conspiracy theories, and I believe the world is flat, et cetera, et cetera. Most people that I deal with in my world are generally people with good faith and are trying to deal with their lives as best and as easily as they can. In my case, because we're in the Ukrainian space, we're daily bombarded by what's going on in the front, and we're looking for allies left and right, and we're all, approaching bankruptcy with the donations and everything. So what I want to hear from you is, where is the demarcation between this good and this bad? Like, how do you, where do we find this thing so we can be more clearer on who's on our side and who's on the other side in terms of what's happening?
I like that question a lot because, to my mind, there is no demarcation line. And the reason I keep drawing this comparison back to this era of late socialism and the USSR is because, you could go through life and say there are people who support the regime and who put the workers of the world unite slogans in their windows, and there are those who don't. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter because the system perpetuates itself on the actions both genuine and disingenuous, right? And I know that sounds a little airy-fairy, but I'll give you a couple examples. I was sitting in a bar writing in Montreal a couple years ago now, and I'm actually sitting and writing a column for the Toronto Star. I just got back from the Freedom Convoy, and I was writing this column about the conspiracy theories and the influencers who had helped kind of create this thing and who had helped pump all this misinformation. And how it kind of had married, genuine concerns, people who had lost loved ones during the pandemic and were furious they couldn't visit them in hospital, and people who, didn't support the vaccine mandates and all this, just a real hodgepodge of people, but including those who were outright liars and conspiracy theorists and hate mongers and the rest. And I'm sitting there writing, this guy sits down next to me. And he starts chatting, and he goes, "Oh, what are you writing? Oh, you're a columnist." And he goes, and I said, "Yeah, I'm just back from the Freedom Convoy and all this." He goes, "Oh, like what's your take?" And we start chatting for a little bit, and as we chat, it becomes clear that he was actually at the Freedom Convoy, and that he was one of the participants. And we start getting into it. We start arguing, and this guy is just a fount. He's actually an engineer. I won't dig at engineers, but he's a fount of misinformation. And he's a fount of all of this stuff. Ukraine has bioweapons labs, and the vaccines have killed 1 million people, and all this other stuff. Otherwise, an unbelievably bright, charming, thoughtful, interesting guy who had been hooked up to this source of complete bullshit and just was incredible at spreading it and repeating it, and who believed it, really on an emotional level. And in the end, we kind of got into some of the emotional reasons why he wound up there. But suffice it to say, when you actually meet these people, more often than not, they're actually lovely. And more often than not, you can sit there and argue. You can sit there and get to some sense of truth. Maybe not a perfect sense of truth. You might not convince them in every circumstance. Maybe you can try this jujitsu method on them and you can get to something approaching consensus or at least agreement, or at least an agreement to disagree. The problem is the internet is far stickier than your conversation with them. At the end of the day, they always go back to their online community. They always wind up back in those spaces where they're downloading this bullshit, not just from sources in Canada, not just from sources in Russia and the US and Germany and the UK and everywhere else. They're plugged into 1,000 voices screaming at them at the same time, and I think that always ends up being more compelling. On top of that, the platforms which they use are addictive, and they're designed to be addictive. We have the data and the research on this, particularly for youth. TikTok knows that changes they make caused people to feel anxiety when they put their phone down. They caused them to feel a sense of loss when they stopped scrolling. It was all a tactic. In the same way certain poker slots or penny slots, certain gambling tactics, tricked people into dumping their life savings into these machines. The internet is doing something very, very similar, and I think we have to grapple with that. I know it is frustrating for people. I think it was frustrating for me. It's frustrating to be told that all of these problems flow back to the internet and to the giant sources of all the knowledge of all human history in our pockets. But it really increasingly seems like this is the departure point. That is the demarcation line between when we had some sense of sanity and when we lost our minds. And the reality is the more time you spend on this thing, the more you lose your mind. And that there is a class of people who are well-intentioned and who are genuinely pleasant people, but who convince themselves that the truth and the community and the meaning and the purpose and the emotions they find in their phones and on their laptop is more important than the conversations they have with real people. And it's really hard to get away from those people having a massively outsized influence on our politics and society.
I grew up believing that the press is honest and unbiased.
Yeah.
Okay. I've given up on that. It seems like the Globe and Mail now is going pro-Putin, which is, I find, embarrassing and shameful. But the media, to me, is not showing enough about Ukraine on a daily basis. We're getting bombarded daily. They're taking out our schools, our hospitals, our energy systems. Everybody's kind of giving up on it. They're not reporting it as much as they should. They report Gaza, they report Venezuela, they report other things, but Ukraine is it's just another war someplace.
I don't disagree. Listen.
Sorry, is there something we could do to try and push it?
If I had it my way, we would be devoting, a whole section of the paper, not the paper matters all that much anymore, but to the conflict still to this day. I've been to Ukraine multiple times. I was there most recently a year and a half ago. I'm really hoping to go back this year. I have a lot of colleagues, friends who spent a lot of time there doing really, really important and great work. And what I will say, I'll say two things. One is that the Globe still does a ton of fantastic journalism, both about Ukraine and from Ukraine. Mark McKinnon is there quite frequently. They hire Ukrainian stringers. Part of the problem is that the Globe no longer has a great vehicle to deliver all that reporting to people, right? Like in a day and time when people still got that dead tree version of the paper at home, maybe, let's imagine the internet doesn't exist and we're still in that world. Maybe Ukraine would not be on the front page, in the year 2026, but there would still be long-form, thoughtful reporting multiple times a week, whether it's from the AP or Reuters or their own journalists, and people would get it. In a world where every single piece of that paper gets hived off and sent to Apple News or Twitter or Google News or whatever, people aren't getting the entire paper anymore. I know I'm just describing the reality of the world we live in, but that is a major factor. Like I see analytics for the paper, and I can tell you that part of the problem is that it's not that we're not publishing it, it's that people aren't reading it because there's no venue to get it to them. And now that does have a negative feedback loop. Because people don't read it, the paper is less likely to commission those stories. And I'm not trying to absolve the papers of all responsibility here. It is our responsibility to get people reading this stuff. But we don't have those channels anymore, right? I'm talking about the ways in which we uploaded our civil discourse to the internet. when those platforms then locked us out, we found ourselves without a way to reach the general public. We can ask them to subscribe to our newsletters and install our apps and go check the website and subscribe to the digital version or whatever, but really hard to do that stuff this day and age. Increasingly, people still rely on these major American companies to get their news. And they think that and not unreasonably, they think this is the best way to learn about the world. But it's offering a very skewed version of it. And unfortunately, that skew is less and less about Ukraine. What I will say, the solution to this is encourage people to go follow, subscribe to, and become partisans of news outlets that do care and that do great work. I always point people to my friend and colleague Tim Mack. He runs an outlet called The Counteroffensive. It's on Substack. It shows right up in your inbox. Fantastic reporting every single day. Tim's not Ukrainian, but he has a whole staff of Ukrainians in a very wonderful palatial office in Kiev that I got to visit a couple years ago. Things like that I think do matter, and the more you can get people to be partisans for this version of good journalism and the truth and get them sharing it, I think it does lead to some positive outcomes. But again, the world we live in is a hard, tough place for good reporting and the truth.
I still have my Facebook account. I know that X is awful because the person at the helm, I don't want to get rid of it because the people I follow have not migrated over to better platforms. So as someone who's in the problem, knowing that I'm still in the problem, is there anything that an individual can do to sort of counter or offer other perspectives?
Yeah, and again, it's a handful of things here. One is, don't treat, and I don't mean any of this to be condescending, I actually think this is advice that people need to genuinely have stapled onto their foreheads, maybe not the people in this room. People need to be more pleasant online. Part of the problem of the internet is that it creates an unreal space where people are angry and frustrated, and not bringing anger to the internet is a great first step. People are going to keep using Facebook. People are going to keep using Twitter. People find it useful. I totally get that. Limiting your time on them, and again, I'm sure you do this, but I tell you, a lot of people don't. Limiting your time on them is incredibly, incredibly important. Using them more and more to share genuine news articles as opposed to whatever bullshit screen caps or memes or whatever, also really useful. But the reality is, we shouldn't have to live our lives online constantly anxious about these things. We should treat them for what they are, sources of distraction and entertainment. We should stop treating them as a stand-in for civic engagement because that's fundamentally what they're not. But finally, there are new platforms that are coming online that aim to be, like I said earlier, decentralized, less profit-driven, not owned by oligarchs and major companies, that aim to be better sources for sharing news and information. And I think the advice I would give is keep an eye out for them. If you find one of these platforms that works for you, I mentioned Substack. Substack is still not perfect, lots of problems with it as well, but it's a source of really great reporting on Ukraine, Canada. My newsletter is on there. Other, kind of really good critical voices. I think that's useful. I mentioned Blue Sky and Gander, which are kind of the same technology that are coming online shortly. The Gander is anyway. Could be an interesting source for Canadian-specific conversations that are not polluted by American, Russian, or whatever influencers. I think that's interesting. But again, like with everything, there's no great answer to that. We as individuals do not fundamentally have the power to fix these problems in the short term. It's going to require some resiliency as hopefully we collectively realize we need to change our ways.
Thank you, Justin. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that Justin is based in Montreal, and he has come in to feature to us this evening, and we're grateful to have such a professional and knowledgeable journalist as Justin. So on behalf of the Ucrainica Research Institute, and indeed all of us here this evening, thank you very much for an excellent lecture.
Thanks for having me.
We are fundraising for the toe and hand warmers for the Ukrainian army. So far, we raised around 25,000 and delivered for 27.5 thousand Canadian dollars to the front lines. Our next goal is 30,000. We delivered more than 55,000 pairs of warmers to the front lines, to more than 160 units. If you work with the military units on the front lines and you know that we need warmers, get in touch with us. We will deliver to the front line. Temperatures are freezing. Over there, the frostbite is a real problem. The trench foot is a real problem. How the war changed in this year. So a year ago, nobody was caring about the weight of those. So right now, many unions basically tell us, don't give us the full-size foot warmers, give us the toe warmers, because we are dropping those from the drones. So the weight matters. So I'll start with the first item, a Lucky Loonie. It's a bit of inflation. So in 2002, when it was introduced, both our teams got gold medals. As you know, today it's only silver, so it's a bit of depreciation in value. But that's an official Lucky Loonie keychain minted by the Royal Canadian Mint, which brings luck if you carry it in your pocket. So the starting bid is $80. Thank you so much. $80 going once. Dmytro, yes? 100. Thank you, Dmytro. Sold. And you know, I have more than one. I know that it's against the rules, but when we are talking about helping Ukraine armed forces, no rules. $100. Thank you so much. So let's do the next item. This is a coin minted by Ukrainian, not royal, but mint, dedicated to the Operation Spiderweb, apparatchik, Ukrainian special forces destroying up to 7 billion worth of the Russian strategic bombers that can no longer actually threaten our Canadian Arctic as well. So it's now in our national interest in Canada to support and collaborate and partner with Ukraine. Starting price, $100. 100, thank you so much. Alexei. Yeah. 120. Yeah. Sold to Alexei. Another coin, like a Ukrainian drone, starting price $80. Okay, 100. Going once, going twice. Дуже дякую. Thank you so much. And the last item, пахучка for your car, для машини. Написано там «Доброго вечора, ми з України». So $20. 40. Okay. If you want just to donate, feel free to donate, so you can do the or PayPal transfer to this email. Any donations are more than welcome, because those are saving lives. Дуже дякую. Слава Україні!